Welcome in, everybody. I see the number slowly growing in the bottom of my screen here. So, uh, welcome on in to the webinar. We're so glad to have you today. We're just going to give folks a couple minutes to get in, get their technology squared away, and then we will get started. So, feel free to say hello in the chat, and we'll just give a couple more seconds to get everybody in. All right, well, we are going to get started with our webinar today. So welcome to Engaging Men and Boys, a conversation on how Canada's family violence shelters are moving upstream. This is an online webinar offered through the Pathways Project with Next Gen Men. So my name is David Sanis. I'm going to be your talking head for the afternoon. I'm the moderator of the event. I'm the manager of the Men's Counseling and Community Initiatives portfolio at Fear Is Not Love in Calgary. This topic is of one of great importance to me in the work that we get to do over here at Fear Is Not Love. And so I'm very excited to be supporting Next Gen Men to do this webinar today. And I'm very excited about the panelists we have and the conversations that we're going to be having together. So welcome here today. I did want to take a moment to start with a land acknowledgement. I recognize that there's probably many of you from outside of Alberta and from all over Canada. And so I just want to encourage you to take a moment while I read our land acknowledgement here for Alberta to consider your own context, where you're from, the land that you reside and work on, and how you can contribute to reconciliation. So in the spirit of respect and reciprocity and truth, we honor and acknowledge the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Nakota nations of Chiniki, Bearspaw, Goodstoney, and Tsuut'ina. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis Nation within Alberta's Districts 5 and 6. And finally, we acknowledge all nations, Indigenous and non, who live, work, and play on this land and who honor and celebrate this territory. So thank you for participating in that. So once again, I just want to thank you all for being here today. It's an important conversation that we're going to be having. Most people in this room, I am assuming, work in shelters, sexual assault centers, and similar organizations. And I think we wanted to take a moment before we got into the conversation today just to acknowledge that this ecosystem of gender-based violence support and organizations and shelters, you already do so much with such limited resources. And even if we understand it, the need to engage men and boys might feel like an added pressure to an already demanding workload. So we want to name that and just express gratitude to all of you for taking a moment out of your day to participate in this discussion and learn how you might take action in this work. I'm deeply grateful for all the support and the partnerships that we have in the community. And so way to go. Thank you for coming. And I'm really looking forward to the next 90 minutes that we have together. We've had over 250 people register for this webinar. I see the number growing in the bottom, and I'm sure folks will trickle in as they get their lunches and get settled for the day. So it just shows that there's a real desire in our space to do more and move upstream and engage men and boys in stopping violence before it starts. So awesome. The number is quite staggering, and we're really looking forward to the time that we get to spend together. A couple quick notes about Zoom. If this was a real life event, we would be doing housekeeping and I'd be orienting you to the space, but because I'm just ahead, I trust you know your own spaces. But just a couple things about Zoom and webinars, if you haven't participated, which I highly doubt at this point in our times. But it's helpful. If it's helpful for you, you may want to turn on closed captioning, which is, I believe, just a button there on the bottom of your screen. That feature can be really helpful as it'll just kind of narrate and pick up my voice and convert to text as we go. As you think of questions during our conversation today, feel free to drop them into the Q&A box. The button for that can also be found on your bottom panel, very important panel. I can't promise you that we're going to get to all the questions, that we're going to have time to get through all the questions, but But as the panelists are sharing their thoughts and things are being discussed, feel free to pop your questions in there, and we will get to them during the Q&A period at the end. Finally, the chat will be active. It is active. And Veronica and Charlotte from Next Gen Men are in the chat and will be available to you if you have any questions. They'll be popping links in there. They'll be offering additional information as we go. So if you're having any technological issues or something's not working for you, please just reach out to Veronica or Charlotte and they will be able to help you. So what are we doing today? Well, we're going to be talking about evidence-based tips about how to engage men in violence prevention. You're going to hear how our panelists have used those tips in practice through their work within the shelter sector, and you will gain new resources and continue learning, growing, and taking action through your work. So that's kind of what we're going to be trying to touch on today. The agenda is on your screen and has been on your screen while I talk. We're going to just do a quick introduction that will be offered by me, just kind of setting the stage for the context of our discussion today. I'm going to do my best to move through that information quite quickly because obviously the panelists have a lot of insight and we want to make sure that we have the time for them to be able to share their discussion. Then we will move into the panel discussion. And finally, we'll save some time at the end, about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. And again, that's where your questions are going to be really important. So please do just pop those into the Q&A section as we go. And then we'll wrap up. We'll let you know how you can keep in touch. And then there will be a resource package that will be sent out after that will kind of give you any additional information you might need. So that's kind of how we're going to do it. So what we are going to do now is launch a quick poll. It's an anonymous poll, but it's going to give us a sense of who's in the room. So please just take a couple minutes, complete the poll, and then we'll have a look at it. So we're going to do that now. All right, so now we have a chance just to look at those poll results. So you can have a scroll through. We won't go everything. I won't go through everything, but 83% of our participants here are female identifying. We've got a variety level of familiarity with the subject matter, so that's awesome. Most folks either work for a shelter organization or a sexual assault violence center. We have some others as well. So that just kind of orients you to who's in the room, who you're spending time with and sharing space with today. And so thank you for taking the moment to do that. So now I am going to introduce you to the topic for the day. As I said, we know that most people in the audiences are probably familiar with the common language we use in our work. However, to ensure that we're all on the same page, I'm going to quickly define some of the terms that we're going to be referring to today. So firstly, what is gender justice? Gender justice is the actions we can take that will both promote gender equity and reduce and ultimately eliminate gender-based oppression and violence. Gender equity recognizes that we live in a patriarchal society where women and gender-diverse individuals inherently experience inequities in power, resources, representation, and access to opportunities. Gender equity aims to recalibrate and redefine power, resources, and opportunities to correct those gaps. Gender-based violence is harm that is perpetrated against a person or group of people because of their actual or perceived sex, gender expression, and/or gender identity. It's not limited to physical violence and can take many forms. Gender-based violence can happen as a form of social punishment for breaking the rules about gender. For instance, violence against queer and trans people might be directed at them for expressing themselves in ways that are inconsistent with existing gender expectations. Gender-based violence is a useful lens through which we can see patterns of violence related to power. Whenever a group of people is systematically disempowered, they're increasingly targeted for violence. As we know, women are almost 4 times more likely than men to have been sexually assaulted at least once before the age of 15 or since the age of 15. For Indigenous women or women with a disability, it's even higher. And gender-based violence is a useful lens through which we can look at violence between men. Think about how often violence between men is connected to establishing dominance hierarchies by attacking one another for failing to perform masculinity the right way. So why work with men to achieve gender justice? Most men do not want to hurt themselves or others. They don't want to be part of the problem. They want to be part of the solution. So how can we create those opportunities? Despite not wanting to be part of the problem, most violence is still committed by men. So if we want to do something to prevent it, it's important that we work with men and support them in taking on positive pro-social roles and identities. Men are also harmed by restrictive gender norms. They deserve the safety and freedom to be their truest selves, and the deeper relationships increased well-being, they deserve the safety and freedom to be their truest selves and the deeper relationships and increased well-being they could have as a result. And lastly, the burden to repair and prevent harm shouldn't fall to women and gender diverse people alone. Men can have a huge impact on the men around them. We are looking for more men to become active participants in this work and to take a stand for gender justice where they live, work, play, and worship. And finally, work towards gender justice and violence prevention through shelters specific, or why should we work towards gender justice and violence prevention through shelters specifically? Through their work, shelters are well situated to reach men who might be at risk of using violence. Whether through developing their own programs or a more robust referral mechanisms, shelter can help the broader GBV ecosystem connect with men to prevent violence and prevent reoffending. Moving upstream, so engaging men and boys in violence prevention helps tackle the root causes of gender-based violence. By working with men to transform harmful norms, beliefs, and behaviors, shelters can promote healthier attitudes towards gender and relationships and reducing the likelihood of male-perpetrated violence. And number 3, sustainability and easing the strain on shelters. Engaging men in violence prevention contributes to long-term sustainable change. It helps dismantle patriarchal society or structures that perpetrate violence, leading to a more equitable and safe world. This can ease the pressure on shelters by reducing violence in our communities, thereby decreasing the demand for emergency services and allowing shelters to provide more accessible support for those in need. Take a breath. That's a lot of information. I thank you for just allowing us to just kind of set that context. A lot of this is obviously research that's been pulled from the work that's been going on behind the scenes. And so, but I think it's really important that we have a shared context. And so thank you for indulging as I share all that information. I know that there's been questions about slides, and I'm sure we'll get this information into your hand because I moved through it quite quickly because I'm on a time crunch. The hardest thing about being an MC and moderating these events is that there's numbers always beside the agenda and the script that the MC has to adhere to, you know. So there's not a lot of time for me to squeeze in jokes. So we're just going to have to move through collectively. So now that we've done all that, we've established the context for our topic. What is Pathways, and why are we hosting this conversation, and why does the project exist? So Pathways is a project funded by Women and Gender Equality Canada and supported by Next Gen Men. The goals of Pathways are to connect existing gender justice and violence prevention practitioners currently working with men and boys with those who would like to do the work, to build a bridge between academic research and action. This is why our panel discussion today is based on research from SHIFT, the Project to End Domestic Violence. And finally, to increase the number of people, especially men, doing gender justice and violence prevention work with men and boys where they live, work, play, study, and worship. This is why Next Gen Men, through Pathways, have brought the conversation to us today. Now, let's move on to the panel discussion. So we're just going to jump right into that conversation, and our panelists each bring unique experiences of working with men to prevent violence through their shelters and adjacent organizations. I'm going to call on each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and they're going to share why shelters moving upstream to engage men and boys in violence prevention matters to them. So let's start with Jill. Jill, can you tell us a bit about yourself and why shelters working with men and boys to prevent violence matters to you?
Absolutely. Thanks, David. So my name's Jill Shillabeer. I'm the manager of all the learning programs at Alberta Council of Women's Shelters. We're the organization, the provincial organization that works with shelters across the province to create a voice of collective advocacy, of knowledge sharing, and an opportunity to grow skills as well as do prevention work in Alberta. So I'm joining you today from Amiskwich, Waskahiken, which is colonially known as Edmonton, so it's the hardest word to say. And I myself am a descendant of uninvited settlers and refuge seekers on this land. So I use she, her pronouns, also welcome they and them. In terms of why I think it's important for shelters and transition houses across the province, as well as other frontline serving agencies in the quest to end gender-based violence, get involved, is that people who work in those agencies, people who work in shelters, understand gender-based violence like no one else. Every day, you see the effects of gender-based violence, the new ways it's manifesting, the breadth of coercive controlling behaviors. You know firsthand the scope of the issue, and you know how many requests for admission you have to turn away. In Alberta, that's tens of thousands a year. So in short, shelter workers are the foremost experts on domestic violence. And I mean, if I were looking to learn more, if you were looking to learn more, to engage in a solution, to try something that might feel a little scary, or just to even challenge your own thinking, I would think I would want to go to the expert, and wouldn't you? So secondly, I also think it's high time that we stop divisive practices in the sector that relegate shelter workers and prevention workers to different silos. Intervention and prevention aren't opposites. They're all part of the same spectrum. Actually, no, that's not right. A spectrum has ends. This is more of a circle. It's a circle of practices that are done to work to end and to address gender-based violence. And so it's all connected. It's all part of one another. And so there's a lot of space to build on everyone's skills, their knowledge, their talents, and as David said, the position that you have in your community. So in short, you know, everything is linked, and it's vital that shelters are not just involved, but key players in that space. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. So next up, we have Kim. Kim, if you could tell us a bit about yourself and answer the same question: why shelters working with men and boys to prevent violence matters to you?
Okay. So hi, everyone. I'm Kim Roos, and I'm the CEO of Fear is Not Love. And I've been working with that organization for about 10 years and started my career working with men and boys in the 90s through another agency in the city of Calgary. And so I think it's important to be engaging men and boys in the shelter context. Much like Jill had said, there's an expertise there. There's also a natural intervention point. And we know that violence impacts everybody. And traditionally and historically, organizations that have been in the shelter world have not actually engaged men well. And there's certainly a movement now to do that. But it is a natural point of intervention for families. So not only are women and children impacted, but men are also impacted. And so for me, the work is critical. If we're actually going to end this issue and not need to keep building shelters that will just fill, we actually need to be working on both ends of the equation. The current system, as it's oriented, it centers victims as the authors of their victimization and their experience and also as responsible for the healing. And so not that, like, I believe shelters are very critical. They're an integral part of the system, but they're one side of the piece. And so those institutions, those groups, those agencies need to be leveraged to shift the focus to men's accountability for their violence. And so for me, it's really important to not be one-sided on the equation and to include all pieces and engaging men at shelter, at entry point, and working with families and everybody to end this issue. Otherwise, we're just going to have to keep building shelters and filling them. So thank you.
Thank you, Kim. And our final panelist is Lynette. Lynette Solden, if you could please tell us a bit about yourself. And I'm sure by this point you know the question, why is moving upstream and working with men and boys in violence prevention important to you?
First off, thank you so much for having me today. My name is Lynette Sullivan, and I'm the Executive Director of Rowan House Society. I've been in the social services sector for over 25 years. Throughout my career, I've been supporting individuals and families experiencing domestic violence and abuse, as well as supporting men and boys. Why does it matter to me that shelters work with men and boys to prevent violence? It is important to recognize the reality that male perpetrated violence and gender inequality are significant issues in our society, and there's a dire need to work with men and boys to remedy it. Shelters are key in supporting men in regards to stopping the perpetration of violence before it starts, and we must include them in our efforts for change. Rethinking the norms, attitudes, and perspectives surrounding domestic violence and abuse, it's a first step to prevention. By asking tough questions, but at the same time, working alongside, I believe men have the power to change, be healed, and to grow. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Lynette. So now we're going to move into the juicy part of the conversation, and we're going to be, just posing some questions to our panelists today. So what we will be doing is we're going to be leveraging Shift's 2022 report titled Calling It In All Men, 26 Recommendations for Engaging and Mobilizing Men to Prevent Violence and Advance Equity. This body of work is fantastic. And I encourage you all to have a read through if you haven't already. The very first recommendation from the report is that men must be engaged for their own liberation, not just as instruments for promoting women's empowerment. So Kim, the first question is for you. What comes up for you when thinking about this recommendation, and can you share any stories of how engaging men as stakeholders in gender justice has worked for you?
Sure. Thanks for that question, David. I'm going to start off with a quote that maybe some people have heard me use before, but if you don't transform your pain, you transmit it. So think about that for the second. If you don't transform your pain, you transmit it. So hurt people hurt people. And I think often when we're talking about men who use violence, people are afraid of that group. They're afraid to work with them. They're afraid to talk to them. They're afraid to engage them for healing. And traditionally, services that have been in the domestic violence and abuse area, we've been working with men for quite a while. In our organization, we've been working with them for over 30 years. But what I would say is that you need to examine how you're actually engaging men and what are you engaging them to, and are you engaging them from their perspective? We know that change happens, developmental and human change happens related to your level of engagement with that change agent. So there's a lot of work with Scott Miller around feedback-informed treatment, and you can measure engagement, you can measure change. And if you do not have engagement, your change will not be as significant. And so imagine for a minute that you have an issue in your life and it's really troubling you, and you're wrestling with it for a couple of years. And then you finally reach out for help, and you go talk to someone, you go talk to a therapist, and you spill your guts out and you share everything and you're vulnerable. And then you set goals that are actually your mother picked your goals for you. How engaged are you in achieving those goals and working towards them? Probably not very. Well, I guess it depends on your relationship with your mother. I would not be engaged in achieving the goal set for me by my mother. We've done the same thing to men for years, where it's come here and we'll change you. Come here and we'll make it different. Come here and we'll help you learn anger management and stop your violence. Rather than, what is it that you're struggling with? How can we help you? How can we be there with you in this and help engage men for change's sake? When I first came to, my organization is now called Fear Is Not Love, and there's a name change story in there, which maybe I'll have time to share, but we were called the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter. And we had a helpline. And one of my first introductions to our working with men and boys was a call on the weekend on a Saturday from a very prominent Calgarian who said, "Did you know that your helpline hangs up on men?" And I did not know that. And so it led to a whole journey about understanding how was our organization actually engaging men. And another story that I tell just related to this that might highlight for you how this really does matter. My first office in the organization was really close to the front door. And every Wednesday, Rob, the Culligan man, would come at 11 o'clock, like clockwork, every Wednesday. And Rob would show up and he'd ring the buzzer. And my EA at the time would run to the door. She'd look through the keyhole and look at the camera. And she would say, "Who are you? Why are you here? Do you have an appointment?" And like this guy literally has a name tag that says Rob. He's got a giant bottle of water on his shoulder and a bunch piled around his feet. And we were grilling him. Why are you here? Who are you here to say? Who are you here to see? Do you have a right to be here? And so this went on, and it went like every Wednesday. And I was like, well, Rob never even takes a holiday. Like, he's got the uniform, he's showing up every week with water. Why are we attacking him at the door every time? And so I asked my EA at the time, and I said, why are we doing this? And she said, well, we're a shelter and we are at risk. We are always under threat. And it sort of rocked me a little bit, because I was like, well, yes, like we have bulletproof glass at the shelter. I don't want to downplay the risk that we deal with. Shelters are critical. And yes, there are threats, but is Rob the Culligan man really a threat? Probably not, right? It would be a very slim chance that Rob the Culligan man would actually have a partner in the shelter and then would show up at MIN to find that out. So I think that what I learned in our organization anyway is that our lens for understanding risk and engagement was very different than what I expected, likely because of the experience of shelter workers and of shelter and of the attacks that they had faced. But then the question then came, well, how are we say we work with men. If we're not letting Rob the Culligan man in, how are we actually engaging men in their practice? And so that led to a very deep exploration over several years and some research studies looking at what was happening in our therapeutic programs, how were men really engaging. And what we learned in the very first blush is that in our men's program at that time, it's no longer this way, thanks to David and others, but most of the clients in the men's program were women. My own staff were afraid to work with men. They were afraid to engage them for their own change. And so this led to a journey of really understanding what were men looking for, how could we actually be the place to land that they would actually come to us for help, and how can we help that journey be meaningful for them, which would lead to real change, sustainable change that would be then measured in their relationships and their relational spaces. And so one of the other additional pieces to this that led to our name change was we were building an initiative called Men And, which I think we've had a panel presentation on that from Dr. Jeff St. John already. But when we were building Men And, we actually talked to 182 guys who had been through different, I'll call them perpetrator programs across the province. And no one had asked them. No one goes and asks these guys, like, what do you need? How did you get here? How did you land in this place for help? And what we learned is most of the guys that we talked to, they had a pretty significant help-seeking journey. And along that way, they touched no less than 3 other agencies, but they weren't engaged along the way. And we were a last resort, because at the time our name was the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter, and we had a lovely tulip as a logo. And the guys would tell us, well, why would I call the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter? Like, that doesn't fit for me. It wasn't an engaging name. But what they did tell us is that once they landed in our new revised men's program, they got engaged, because the therapists, regardless of what our name was, were very focused on these men and what their needs were. So certainly we consider safety and repair. So if anyone was in town for the Todd Augusta Scott event that we hosted, safety and repair is really critical to our work, but it starts with engagement. And so if someone else is naming, so again, back to my example of your mother setting your goals, if your mother's setting your goals for you, you're less likely to engage in the process and change. And so we really try and focus on what is it that is causing pain and discomfort for men in their life, and then we work from there. As soon as you introduce all the other elements of what other people's expectations are for them, especially at the very beginning of the work, it's not going to work. We even had a practice at one point where in our old version of men's counseling, the very first session or the very first phone call, men were required to take accountability for their violence. So imagine picking up the phone after years, likely, because men search for help for anywhere between 18 months to 2 years before they ever call someone. So imagine you're 2 years wondering if you should reach out for help, and you finally do, and the first phone call is, well, we won't see you unless you admit that you're accountable for the violence. And so of course engagement would drop. So I think it is really important to shift that lens to focus on the dignity of the humanity of that individual in front of you, whether they've perpetrated violence, experienced violence, used to, it might be. I see our job as helping people have the tools and the guidance and support and whatever it might be to create safety and repair in their own relationships and their own lives. And I think that shelters are a center point for that, and can be, and they have a natural engagement point with men, with families, with dads in particular. And I feel that we will not make movement on this issue unless we are actually engaging men for their own liberation, and not for us to feel better about them being accountable or admitting to what they've done wrong. I think we do have a system that is built that reinforces almost victim blaming at times, and there's a lot of responsibility put on women or victims to change the situation. I've heard often people have said, "Can you teach the women to pick better men?" No, that is a very victim blaming statement. Instead, why don't we teach all of us how to be better in relationship? How do we be safe? How do we be nurturing? How do we be engaging and connecting in our relationships? And I have yet to meet someone who really doesn't want that. And we've served a lot of men through our men's counseling and through our outreach and other programs. And very often, one of the key points, the turning points for them where they actually start to change and to seek other things, is when someone listened to them and engaged with them from where they were at. So I think this is actually a very critical recommendation from Lana's work. And I was really glad to see it highlighted in that way. So I'll leave that there.
Thank you, Kim. And I think in my role, obviously, with the men's counseling program here at Fear Is Not Love, I get a chance to review the data from the work that's being done. And I can say with utmost confidence that the individuals and the men that work through the course of the program overwhelmingly do take accountability for the violence. We don't require them to, but they do. And we know that from their own reflections, and we know that from the reflections of their partners, which I think is a really important thing to acknowledge, that demanding or requiring accountability versus inviting someone in to the process of doing their own safety and repair work is a really powerful differentiator. And yeah, thank you so much for those reflections, Kim. Lynette, we'll come to you now. And the recommendation we're going to discuss is number 8 from the report. And that is, when working to engage men, we should go to places where men already congregate, specifically places where they live, work, socialize, play, and worship. So Lynette, can you tell us a bit about your experience with this recommendation? What has been the impact when you've engaged with men in their own spaces, and how have you done it?
Thank you so much, David. In one Canadian study with over 2,300 men, 96% wanted support to achieve healthy relationships and well-being. However, many of the men surveyed did not know where to get help and identified their perception of masculinity was preventing them from seeking help. We have found it important to meet individuals in their comfort zone, and we do this through the following ways. So we're just going to start off with the first one, which is community presentations and trainings. The other one is provide an outreach approach for individuals experiencing and individuals causing harm. And so I'm going to start with the community one. So in the community, we have offered and provided presentations and trainings to businesses, clubs, churches, and municipalities. We have offered community partners trainings on the importance of positive and healthy relationships, on the services that are available. Rowan House has also been in partnership with Imagine Institute for Learning, where we'll be hosting a trauma-informed support to help those in need on their journey, to have them walk away with a better awareness of how you can make a difference and be an ally. We know it is important to invite men into the conversation, which starts from a place of hope that change is possible. It can help shift the conversation from men as a problem to them being an essential component of the solution. Additionally, from an outreach support approach, we would support men who are experiencing domestic violence and abuse, as well as men who are causing harm. We'll meet with them in an area of comfort. Additionally, we'll provide several alternatives, such as in-person meetings, virtual, or a hybrid. We have found that when we meet individuals in their space, their comments are more free-flowing. They're feeling listened to. They feel that they're being treated with respect, dignity, and that they're feeling more vulnerable to say exactly what they're thinking and to have those tough conversations. We find conversations become broader and deeper when everyone is involved and feels safe enough to speak what's on their mind. Something that really also resonated with me is an important quote from Robert Wright, who is a Canadian activist. One of the things we understand about social justice movements is they take flight when we experience convergence, when the interests of the oppressed and the interests of the oppressor become to converge, when we're able to see ourselves as allies. And this is really key in the work that we do with men. The other thing is that we are really working from a lens of calling people in versus calling people out. And I think that's a very important distinction as well when we are talking to men, engaging men, and wanting to make sure we're meeting them where they're at. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette. Sorry, I lost my mouse. It was off on the side and I couldn't find it. So that's why it just took me a moment. Yeah, thank you so much, Lynette. I'm just going to take a pause for a moment and acknowledge that we're 40 minutes almost into this webinar and I don't see a single question in the Q&A box. So please, as our panelists are sharing and reflecting on their work and these recommendations, or if you have additional questions from the recommendations, be plopping them in the box so that we can get to them at the end. I think it's an opportunity for us to get feedback and to make sure that the content is relevant to you. And how often do you get these three types of individuals into one room where you can ask them questions and get their answers? So please just be thinking of that as we move through. So Jill, moving on to you. So we are now going to move into recommendation 4 from the research, which suggests that funders need to invest in programs that go beyond changing individual attitudes and beliefs. Traditional approaches to behavior change sometimes assume that awareness and attitude change will lead to behavior change. However, behavioral science research shows us that behaviors are often influenced more by contextual cues like social norms, meaning that programs focusing solely on attitudes and awareness will likely limit their effectiveness engaging men. So Jill, can you tell us a bit about what comes to mind when you hear this recommendation and how you've used it in your work?
Yeah, and I think, before I dive right into the meat of it, I want to call back to something that you mentioned in the introduction and in the setup, David, because I think this is a really important frame that we have to keep in mind through this conversation. And it's really this idea of patriarchal society, right? We're operating in a society that is both overtly and subtly misogynistic. And that's what lays the groundwork for gender-based violence to happen. So if you just think about, how many times a day someone has an experience that has misogynistic or trans-misogynistic undertones, or overtones, it's going to take a lot of work to get us to a society that's more gender equal, that uses those equality pieces to get to, equity pieces to get to equality. Thinking of anything from advertising, pay inequity, interrupting or talking over women when they're speaking in a meeting, expecting women to take on care duties, assuming a doctor is a man, dismissing women's pain, especially menstrual pain, or calling it the WNBA and not the MNBA. Little things like that is really how pervasive our patriarchal society is. And so it's really important that we focus on calling in, as Lynette mentioned, it's so great taking that strengths-based approach and calling in all men, not just men who cause harm, men who think that they're at risk of causing harm, but all men can be part of that. And sort of calling back to what Kim was saying, I love that you started with a quote, Kim, because that reminded me of another quote that I think is so useful. It's Leela Watson's quote of, "If you've come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And I think that's really how we want to be calling men into this conversation. So thinking specifically about that idea of working with men to change attitudes and beliefs, not being quite enough, I want to start by saying, maybe controversial, that's vital, right? We need to do that step. That's part of it, but it's only part of the story. And if we just think about our own lives and we take out the category of gender-based violence for a second, we all know we should eat less processed food. We should wear sunscreen. We should not look at our phones 30 minutes before we go to bed. But really, how many of us do that? We don't, right? Where we can know, we can have the knowledge, but we don't change our behavior until we also have the compulsion. So we need the knowledge, we need the skills, and we have the compulsion. And anyone who's worked in change management will tell you there's a whole process to it. Desire is fundamental in that. So when it comes to gender-based violence, we need to understand the issue. We need to understand, how we can respond, what those tools are to respond, and get people really seeing themselves as part of the solution, which has already been mentioned. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our work at ACWS through leading change, or eating change, as it appears to be, with my head in the way. But the leading change model, it really focuses on challenging all of these things, those systemic cultural pieces, as well as individual pieces, but a lot around group norms as well. And we know that transformational culture change is slow, but it does require both individual and systemic change. So it can feel futile sometimes because the problem can feel really big, but we've all lived through culture change. And something, that used to be the norm is now considered acceptable or vice versa, or unacceptable or vice versa. And, if you just think about simple things, again, not related to GBV, but something like hybrid work, that was not a normal thing 5 years ago, and now it is. Change happens, and this change can happen too. So while we're open to working with absolutely anybody who wants to engage in gender-based violence prevention, particularly men and boys, through leading change, we're very fond of, and we do tend to focus on working with pre-existing groups, like a sports team or a workplace, a faith-based group, or other groups. And in those spaces, they're preconditioned to develop group norms and to hold each other accountable for their actions. So not just their attitudes and their beliefs, but their actions. So for example, when we started working in professional football, over a decade ago, we heard from the players that they felt like they could totally go out and affect change in their communities, but they were scared to try to affect change in their locker room because that was really close to home. But once we worked with them, supported them to find different options for expressing themselves and ways to do that calling in, and when it's necessary, calling out, we found that they felt really comfortable keeping one another accountable and making that locker room their space of change. And we've seen it with team after team after team, group after group. So almost all men come to this conversation wanting to better understand the issue, get the knowledge, the statistics, the scope. And we know from stats from the Canadian Women's Foundation from just 2023 that 65% of Canadians know a woman who has experienced physical, psychological, or emotional abuse. But most of these men who are really curious about those stats will dive into working around building skills. And it's those pieces that Kim highlighted around relationship development, right? Communication, consent, healthier expressions of masculinity that aren't limited to the box that they're put in the patriarchy. So we work together to build those skills, to intervene in supportive and survivor-centered ways. And we're not just talking about intervening in situations of extreme violence. We're talking about, the day-to-day experiences where that gender-based violence is showing up in those quieter, but more common, really pervasive ways. And one of the most interesting things that we've seen, particularly when working with men, is a fundamental change in the way that they communicate, not just with their partners, not just in relationships, but with each other. So we evaluate everything. We evaluate everything we do, and we've heard many times in our evaluations, and directly from individuals who will come up to us after an engagement, after conversations, particularly in sports teams, that players are feeling more connected as a team, and they feel safer having all types of difficult conversations after they do the Leading Change program. So we practice bystander interventions with them. We can see them build those skills to call each other in, and then use those norms on their teams to support healthy and pro-social choices. And I should note, anecdotally, teams that work with us do tend to win more. We follow that. But that's not our goal. That's not our goal. Our goal is to get them to feel more knowledgeable about gender-based violence, but more specifically, more ready to act when they notice the signs, and more open to expressing healthier forms of masculinity. We see that as well. We see it all the time with these guys. It's great to work with them over a period of time and really see them grow and change. So starting with those communication skills that I noted before, we see them feeling more engaged in the issue and moving that needle from the idea that it's enough to not be part of the problem towards seeing themselves inside the solution in that great way that Lynette mentioned. So they report having the skills and the confidence to actually act, and they have told us all of their stories. We've heard about them supporting coworkers, clients, friends, and all of it in a survivor-centered way, not in that victim-blaming way that we've been talking about, and helping people get to safety. So it's really that my liberation is bound up with yours conversation. But there's a piece of the recommendation I haven't spoken to yet, and that's the funding piece. Funding transformational change is a struggle in the current project-based short-term approach to funding initiatives. They value sort of new shorter-term, let's try something new approaches over proven programs. And that's not to say that new is bad. New can be fantastic, but we need to have investment in those longer term or operational activities that can create the type of transformational change that we're looking for. And without doing that, we end up ignoring the knowledge of folks in the sector, like everyone who's attending today, who live and breathe this work every day. Now, I'm really optimistic that we can get to that place of understanding. I spent time as a funder as well as in nonprofit, and I know that change can happen there too. And it's basically my whole piece to bring to the conversation today is change can happen. But I think, we really do need to do that work of valuing what shelter workers know, what they bring to prevention conversations and long-term investment. But that is going to take a systems overhaul in how we fund the sector, whose value or whose knowledge we value, how we measure results, and how we build on existing innovations and evidence-based proven initiatives that are already existing in the province.
Thank you, Jill. That was a wonderful response. Thank you so much for just digging into that with us. All right, we are going to move on to another recommendation. I did want to just point out, there was a comment in the chat just about how often these types of webinars and these discussions tend to really frame men as the abusers and women as victims. I would just acknowledge that I think we all know that this issue is not binary and that it is not locked behind how one identifies as a gender. Many of the organizations representing today run supports for individuals impacted by violence, and those programs aren't gendered, meaning that male victims are and can receive support. I think we tend to slip into the binary language and identifying men as perpetrators because of the research, because of the overwhelming research that shows that men are perpetrating violence, but it's not as simple as just language. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. I think we hold that tension all the time when we're talking about this issue. And I thank you for the comment. So Kim, let's move on to recommendation 10, which is about making spaces more welcoming for men. So to unpack that a little bit before passing over to you, many domestic violence organizations are female focused with good reason. However, there are some spaces, parenting, childcare environments, where a female-centric approach may be based on biased or outdated assumptions, i.e. the assumption that men are uninterested in caretaking opportunities. Therefore, it is important to consider the ways in which the environment may in fact be perpetuating the lack of male involvement. And so, Kim, if you could just take a moment to tell us a little bit about how this recommendation resonates with you and how you at Fear Is Not Love have created a welcoming environment for men who want to be agents of change in the gender-based violence space.
Thank you, David. And as a leader in our organization, as a man, thank you. So first off, I'd like to say there's a few observations I have in our sector. And that is, there's a lot of organizations even that don't allow men on their boards, right? And they certainly don't allow them working in shelter, et cetera. I would argue actually that shelters also need to be inclusive and friendly and engaging to men. And I know that's gonna, like, a lot of people will hate me for that, saying that, and hate me for doing that. That's okay. But I'm gonna talk a little bit about a study that we actually did about 8 years ago and the impact of that on our clients and on our staff. So we decided, we had a great applicant for the helpline. And in our organization, the helpline is actually embedded in the shelter. It's a bit of a separate program. funded separately, but it's housed within the same building. And the applicant like blew away the interviewers, but he was a man. And it came to me as, we can't hire him, but he's amazing, but we can't hire him. So I asked foolishly, I said, why not? And they said, well, because he's a man. And I'm like, okay, well, that's a bit of a human rights issue, isn't it? And so it opened up this whole conversation about trauma and safety and repair and, triggering and all this sorts of stuff. So I said, okay, let's slow this down and let's ask. And again, just like with the men who've used violence, very few people had actually asked residents of shelters what they thought about male counselors and men working with them. So what we found is, we interviewed 28 sector leaders, and we interviewed about 55 women who stayed in not just our shelter, but other shelters. And guess what we found? We found that all of these sector people said men should absolutely not be involved in shelter unless it was an outreach, and they had all these restrictions about where men should be. And then the client said, I want healthy male role models for my children. A guy who has been screened by your agency and is working there is actually safer to me than, random stranger on the street. And I trust your agency and I trust your supervision. And I actually want my children to not be afraid of men. And some even said, I prefer a male counselor because I can relate to them better. So this was very surprising news. And I was asked to release it to a broader group, and I never did, because I was rightly afraid that people would sort of come at me and say I'd changed the study or I'd done whatever. But we sat with this. Our organization will remember, like Lynette will remember this. We sat with this for a while about, well, what do we do with this? So then I went to the shelter the next week, and I'm checking out a room that has had some damage, and I look around and I realize, well, there's Shane. So Shane is our facilities guy. Shane has a pack of keys that gets him into every room in the shelter anytime, day and night. Here is Shane, who has access to all of the electricity, all of the IT, all of the facilities related things. Every room in the shelter, Shane can come into it. No one was reacting to Shane. Yet my staff are reacting to hire a man in a helpline office on the other side of the building, right? Like all of it. So I started to ask more questions about what was actually going on there. And what I learned, and actually this impacts David Sanis as well, because what I learned was that our environment was not very male friendly. Our leadership team was mostly women. Our staff are mostly women. Our board has always been 50-50, and that's worked well. But I started to ask these questions about, well, why not? Why is Shane okay, but this person's not? And so it took a while to bring our staff along. The clients had no trouble with having men working in the shelter. So think about that for a second. The clients that we are supposed to be client-centered and serving had no trouble with men screened and supported and supervised being in their environment. And so nowadays, if you walk into our shelter, we're also pet friendly. So you'll see pets, you will see people of all genders everywhere, and no one is freaking out. No one is scared, and it is actually a very calming environment that I think supports safety and repair. But it is quite transformational, and a lot of people would not agree with me or would react. But I think if we're going to create environments where we're inviting people to heal, they need to see themselves in the people that are helping them heal as well, right? We see that representation really matters, and it matters for men too, which leads me a little bit to our rebrand. So we were called the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter. We've been around for 50 years, and we ended up changing our name quite unexpectedly, really, because we are not just Calgary. So we have programs that go province-wide and even outside of the province now. We do not just work with women. Our largest client group is actually children. We are not just for emergencies. Only 3% of our clients come through the shelter. But I want to be clear, that shelter's still critical. I don't want to hear later that, oh, Kim says shelters don't matter. No, that's not true. Shelters matter very much so. But 3% of our most critically traumatized or critically acute clients come through shelter. And we're not just shelter. So a lot of clients, and again, we talk to them, were not calling us because they were like, well, I'm not really in an emergency. I'm not really, I don't need a shelter. So they weren't calling us. And so the name change did not please my donors. I can assure you there were lots of donors that prefer the old name. They might have been involved in the old name, but it pleased our clients. And so the name change was part of making our sort of engagement, our first point of contact for whoever you are is engaging. Fear is not love. There's nothing in that that says you have to be a certain way or a certain person to show up, right? So we have men's lines, we have regular crisis lines, we have bystander lines, we have all that. So we now have all sorts of people calling us for help. And the idea is we need to engage them at that point of intake, whoever they are, where they're at. I would also say that our staff proudly wear the swag now that says fear is not love. Whereas you can bet we're in Calgary Women's Mercy Shelter. Well, some people might come up to you and with their story, other people might yell at you. I was yelled at wearing my t-shirt because I represented a shelter and people have ideas about that. But most often, if you wear a Fear is Not Love hoodie, and if anyone wants one, send me a note, I can get you one. If you wear a Fear is Not Love hoodie, people will come up to you and ask you what that means, and then you end up in a conversation. So to me, the idea is we need to create workplaces and settings and clinical environments and agencies that are welcoming to everybody, whether it's on the staff level, the client level, because quite frankly, this movement to end gender-based violence, and to Jill's point, there are systemic things happening here that a program will never change. One agency and one program will never make this change. It requires all of us to be a part of making a welcoming community for all. So I just think that leads to healing, it leads to safety, it leads to engagement. And that is, that's how I see this recommendation. So I love this recommendation. I think it's a great one.
Thank you so much, Kim. And I think I was just recently, outside of this context, just being interviewed for a research project. And this question was actually posed to me about, like, why did you get into the working in the gender-based violence space? And I think safety is a really important consideration for everybody, including recruiting male identifying staff, because I think if you're afraid that you can't contribute as your whole self to the issue, then you don't want to work in that environment. And I can tell you that you still need to do your work. You need to acknowledge patriarchy. You need to acknowledge your privilege. But there's such a unique opportunity to contribute. And I think, yeah, I can publicly thank you for making this space safe for me as a leader, but also just I think it's not just clients. I think it's important to consider that from a recruitment perspective and how you create safe working spaces for male identified individuals to contribute to the issue as a whole. So thank you for that. Moving on, Lynette, it's your turn again. So we're gonna chat about more creative methods are needed to motivate men and engage men. So Lynette, you've adopted some innovative approaches to engaging men in violence prevention at Rowan House. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've done and how you're being more creative in your approach to engage men? How being more creative in your approach to engage men has worked for you.
Awesome. Thank you, David. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of history. So the Rowan House Society Safe at Home started as a 4-year project in 2019, which was made possible through a federal grant with Women and Gender Equality. The Safe at Home program was first of its kind in a rural setting. It started as a facility in Claresholm, Alberta, which is a very small rural community, and we were supporting a capacity of 2 males in the facility. It worked with men who were concerned about their behavior and the harm that it was causing to their families and friends. The program provided one-to-one and group sessions to the individuals for approximately 52 weeks. Through the pilot project, we were advised of some barriers, which resulted in us having to review the process and to make some, I would say, quick, fast revisions to ensure that we were supporting in a different way. So for the last 9 months of the pilot project, we decided to change the approach of the project to ensure we're serving more individuals in a more effective way in the community, resulting us to move to an outreach approach. The program provided opportunities for healing, repair, and using compassionate accountability through our approaches. Unfortunately, our funding did end and we had to close the program. However, recently we received funding and have restarted the Safe at Home program. So the current Safe at Home program is designed to be an alternative approach to helping families experiencing domestic violence and abuse. The Safe at Home outreach worker provides support to individuals that are causing harm by providing one-to-one support, group sessions, and an option to access a cool down approach. We will be working with the RCMP in our district, as well as probation officers and some community members to ensure that we're responding to domestic violence and abuse calls, that the individual that is causing the harm is provided with opportunities that they can access supports as well. And so for an example, an RCMP member responds to a domestic call, and the typical response is usually for the women and the children to access support through an emergency shelter. What our hope is that we're going to now provide an alternative that the RCMP will stop, reflect, and actually ask the person who is causing harm if they would like to access the Safe at Home cool down hotel. The cool down approach involves opportunity for individuals causing harm to access a hotel in their community for approximately 2 to 5 days while the individual and children remain in the home. And so that is the people who are experiencing domestic violence and abuse. During this time, the outreach worker will work through an individual engagement, and they will ensure it's an engagement for accountability process. This means integrating a trauma-informed approach into efforts to engage men. And as the engagement process kind of moves forward, the outreach worker will introduce an accountability plan to work collaboratively with the individual. The accountability plan will focus on the following: individual strengths, what they value and what they're compassionate about, how they will manage their escalation and the harm that they're causing, how will they ensure their partner and the children are safe, who are their accountability partners when things are becoming escalated and harm is starting to happen, and then what is their follow-up plan. The purpose of the accountability plan is not to engage right from the beginning. It would be kind of more as the engagement process starts to take place. So that is sort of one of our unique approaches that we're working with when it comes to engaging men. And I do want to share a quote from a participant from the Safe at Home program. The group helped. It really helped connect with the other men with similar concerns. Also, my self-awareness changed. I am more aware of what I'm doing and being able to manage situations in a calmer manner. My expectations was to change my ways, accept responsibility, stay calm in the situation, and to deal what was faced in front of me. I feel confident more that I can now deal with things in a more respectful and calm manner. We really find that by providing alternative approaches and services, by building rapport, developing empathy, understanding one's fears and concerns, we will start to further strengthen engagement with the men that we're working with. And so I just wanted to also provide that this is a program that, as I said earlier, was originally in place. We did not receive further funding, so we had to put it on hold, and we're just really excited to be able to restart the process. And currently we are actually have a wait list that we are working with, as we just hired the 2 new outreach workers as we speak. So we're really excited about the next steps in our approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette. It's a wonderful program. Thank you so much for sharing a bit of that information and context with us. So the last recommendation we're going to explore before we get into Q&A, and thank you so much. You've all graciously accepted my invitation and written some wonderful questions for our panelists. So I look forward to getting into that stage of the webinar. But we're going to chat about recommendation number 18, which is the importance of anticipating negative reactions to change so that you can develop strategies to mitigate or address them. So this is for Jill. Jill, can you tell us a bit about how you have mitigated or addressed negative reactions to change when working with men in your organization?
Absolutely. So again, through our community-based work, which is all branded as Leading Change, we work with all genders. We work with widely diverse groups. We do a lot of work that is specifically with men and boys, and a lot of our work was built in that structure. But I've seen a few questions pop up around, providing prevention strategies, primary prevention, secondary prevention, intervention, all around diversity of genders. So I did want to highlight that. We also, just as a reminder, work with people, and not just people who are using violence, but really everyone who's affected by the patriarchy, and in this structure where we have this differentiation of value among genders. There was also a question about, do we work with immigrants? And absolutely, we have a program called Immigrant Youth Leading Change, where we're currently revising our program to be more responsive in that regard, making sure that it's more reflective of the experiences of immigrants, newcomers and refugees in Alberta. And I know there's folks on the call who are very engaged in that program. So there's a lot of opportunities, but anytime you open up opportunities, you can face some resistance, and it may feel surprising, though I doubt that, based on people making comments about getting yelled at when they're wearing a shirt. This is women's shelter. Not everyone gets up in the morning excited to talk about gender-based violence and how to prevent it. Not everyone is going to start from the same place in this conversation. And what we find is a lot of people who are engaging in community-based work, so people who aren't in mandated programs, but people who are showing up to a workshop might be showing up because their workplace or their sports team or their school has set it up, and it was not an option for them. They're part of a collective experience of this training, so they may not want to be there at the beginning, but we do everything we can to make sure that they want to be there, they find value in the time once they've been there. And we actually do find in our evaluations, most people do find it very valuable and very safe to have the conversation. So really what I want to say is, there's a fair amount of resistance to this conversation. There's patriarchy has built a desire to not have accountability for the violence that happens to women and gender minorities. But it doesn't mean that folks who are reluctant to show up, who might be showing up because they came with a friend or because their workplace said they had to, it doesn't mean they can't be reached. It just means we have to be thoughtful. We have to be creative about how we approach the conversations and the interventions, knowing that we are going to face some form of resistance. Many people are hoping to learn, unfortunately, that violence can end by changing a system or a policy or something outside of themselves. We hear that a lot, like, oh, you talk to us, sure, but we really need to go talk to these people. But this comes to personal change, personal behavior change, as well as systems. It's a both and, not an either or. And the more we can get away from those binary oppositions in these conversations, the better. Funding and working in programs that work with men and boys doesn't mean we're taking away from services for women and girls. It's both and. But knowing that idea that it really does come down to individuals and how they choose to move through society and what they want to influence around them, that can be another source of resistance, because people don't see themselves initially as part of the problem. So shifting themselves to think about themselves as part of the solution can be challenging. We use a cartoon, people may have seen it in all of our presentations, where there's a speaker at a podium and a room full of people, and he says, how many people want change? And everyone raises their hand. And then he says, how many people want to change? And no one does. And unfortunately, that's just such a common way of looking at these issues. So we've seen a lot of backlash lately as well in terms of gender equality writ large. Most obviously in sort of online rhetoric about men's rights, trad wives, passport bros, all of that conversation that's happening in the manosphere. And if you want to learn more about it, look at the last Pathways webinar, because it was fantastic with diverting hate. But this is just an evidence of how social change movements tend to happen. There's a pendulum swing that'll occur in resistance. So there's general refusal among some people to accept that we are starting at a misogynistic and transphobic baseline in our work, and that what we see as normal is actually problematic. So this can lead to various forms of manifesting resistance in a room. And it can be really tough to deal with resistors in the room, especially if it's a group that already has established norms and behavior among themselves. It can show up in lots of different ways. It can be disengagement. It can be disruptive behaviors, people making jokes, having side conversations, being on their phones, not paying attention, or choosing to be actively disruptive, debating small things. It can be outright anger. And as the person leading the discussion at the front of the room, especially as if you're someone who works directly on the front line and you see survivors every day, that resistance can really feel like an attack. It can feel like a professional or personal attack. But what we find through the leading change work is that the most important aspect of dealing with resistance, and you know, you can take this beyond GBV work. It's just a good frame for dealing with resistance and generally, is to remain undefended in that conversation. You don't bite, you don't debate. We all remember that. We're in the back of the car and we're wrestling with our siblings because they poked us. And what does our parents say? They say, don't react. It's the same advice. So come at it from a place of curiosity instead, as best you can. Ask questions, listen to understand, try to seek common ground. It's not easy. I'm not pretending like it's easy, but as soon as you start to engage in defensive behaviors, you start to jump into that debate with resistance, you put yourself into a conversation where somebody's right and somebody's wrong. And that totally shuts down learning. It shuts down growth, and it fosters people to choose sides. And we all know from watching the news or anything online these days just how productive those types of conversations can be, where folks are pitted in their positions and just don't want to have any form of discussion. So, you know, I could talk about dealing with resistors for days. So I'm going to try to be brief in terms of the tools that we use to help establish group norms at the outset and really get into that place of discussion and really welcome people to bring different ideas and make it safe for them to do that. Because the safer they feel in the conversation, the more open they are to change their attitudes, their beliefs, and then subsequently that piece we're looking to get to, their behaviors. So in leading change, we start with an exercise that normalizes the idea of disagreeing. It's actually really fun. We get as people excited, we get them up and moving around, and we get them excited to sort of share differing opinions and explain their view. And again, given our current social context, we really don't have a lot of venues for discussion. So we really want to create that. And we don't tell them how to disagree. We just let them practice it because people do come to this normally. We know how to do this in our souls. We just don't practice it on a regular basis. So we start with ideas that aren't charged at all. They seemingly have nothing to do with gender-based violence, but things that most people will have an opinion on, like, you know, that age-old debate, should the toilet paper come off the top of the roll or out the bottom of the roll? Everyone has an opinion on that. But there's really no right or wrong, right? And what we want to do is just start talking about why. Why would you know, why do you think this? Why do you think that? And engage in that questioning aspect and giving people the space to really explain their ideas, because we find that people, you know, come to common ground very naturally. They have, you know, they might seem pitted, oppositional at the start, but really they're coming at it from the same place. They want good things. People in generally are good and generally want good things. But, you know, this is really a safety building exercise. It also helps us as facilitators learn the dynamics of the group. We can encourage that idea of asking questions, and we can also welcome diverse voices to speak up in the conversation without that fear of judgment or reproach. Another piece that we bring to those conversations is we don't present. We're not at the front with, you know, I'm going to tell you A, B, C, D, and E, and off on your way. We facilitate. So we know, we assume that there's knowledge and experience in the room. We know that. We can look at all of our statistics that we've talked about during this presentation today, during this webinar, and say, yeah, we're aware that people know things. They have lived experience. And all people, no matter their gender, their age, or their background, are influenced by their peers. So we encourage attendees to engage throughout the session. We welcome them to challenge us. We try to remain undefended, and bring that response to questions and really build those new norms when we're in the space together. So we know from our experience of running this program, you know, we've been doing prevention work and engaging with men and boys since the 1980s. It's been branded as leading change for well over a decade at this point. We know that people are more likely to take something away and change their behaviors if they feel like an active participant in what's going on. So we can sort of bring those resistors into the conversation. Just telling them information, going back to the previous recommendation, just changing their knowledge is not enough to change behavior. So, for example, when we're at the outset of working with groups of young men, we ask them, who do you look up to? Who do you admire? And let me tell you, in the last couple of years, we have had a lot of young men tell us that they look up to Andrew Tate. And the gut reaction might be like, oh, wow, oh, no, okay. But we will, again, trying not to bite or debate. We don't say that he's a bad guy or shun him or anything like that. We ask them why. Why do you look up to Andrew Tate? Because we want to get a sense of what of his beliefs resonate with folks. And usually it's not like we think human trafficking is great. That's not the case. They're looking up to it for other reasons. And so we can actually build a critical conversation around it and give people those skills to look at things in a little bit of a different way that they can then take forward into their communities, into their lives, into their own social networks, to have more critical thought about what soup they live in, what they're seeing and breathing all the time, so that they can actually affect that change. And fundamentally, we work really hard to make sure that everything that we talk about is rooted in evidence. We cite all of our statistics, and we try as much as possible to draw from what might be perceived as neutral sources. So places like Statistics Canada. It's pretty hard to debate with the police reported crime statistics from Stats Canada. We use a dual facilitator model. We make sure that there's two people facilitating so that they can support each other through those tough conversations when resistance might occur. And we practice. We talk about the different types of resistors we face. We debrief. We get a sense of sort of what are the common patterns that come up. We have the jokers. We have the statisticians. We have the non-believers, right? We have, people resist in repetitive ways generally. Sometimes they'll surprise you, but we practice to get ready for that. And when we're training our member shelters across the province, we practice that with them as well, because our members also, take leading change curricula forward. So we research and prepare to discuss current events so that we're ready for what might be in the minds of people in the room. So let me tell you, I know a heck of a lot more about Andrew Tate than I would choose to, or Sneeko, or the Manosphere movement, Jonah Hill's text messages, P. Diddy, or a couple of years ago, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. It's on their minds. And so that's what they're going to want to talk about, because it's a real life example. So we get ready for that and make sure that we can talk about it again in that undefended manner. But ultimately, we focus on the people in the room when we're facing resistance, the people in the room who want to be there, the people in the room who are engaging. I mentioned before, we've got 65% of Canadians reporting that they know a woman who's experienced abuse. They're in your room. People with lived experience are in your room. And our goal is to make them feel safe, as safe as possible. We want to have the growing number of people, and it's going to happen during a session, who didn't see something before, but now they know a little bit more and they realize that there was something in their lives in the past. We want them to feel safe in this conversation. There's somebody there. So we really, really focus on them. And then we deal with resistors as it comes up. We assume that it probably will be. We're prepared for it, but we don't build to it. We build to the people who are ready. They've had a sensitizing experience. They're ready to start making that change. And then we work on skills building.
Thank you so much, Jill. Okay, so that's the end of our formal Q&A with the panelists. We have just a few short moments here before the end of the webinar. So we're going to do a quick audience poll just to see which recommendations or strategies you'd like to learn more about. So the poll is going to pop up right now. You can quickly answer that. And then I'm just going to quickly go through the questions. We definitely will not have time today to get to all the questions you offered, but thank you so much for them. I would encourage you, if your question does not get answered, there will be a post-conference package, I assume, with some contact details. You could reach out to the panelists directly and ask your question. There was a couple questions in there about working, that I saw in the chat, and about working with men specifically, especially in therapeutic environments around things like addictions and managing those things. you're welcome to reach out to me. We'll get my contact information. I'd love to talk to you with how we manage some of those things within the context of the men's counseling program. And so some of the more specific questions I'm happy to tackle offline as well. So I can make sure that my information will be there as well, and you're welcome to reach out and we can have a conversation about that. But we will try and get to a couple of the themed questions that kind of came up more than once to tackle those today. So here are the results to the poll. I mean, there's a smattering of results. People want to learn more. The largest one is the creative approaches to engaging men. And folks seem to be really interested, fired up, exactly, to learn more. And so thank you so much for participating in that poll. So one of the questions that came up in a couple different ways was around funding initiatives to support men. And so Kim, one of these questions, a couple of folks said, I want to do this kind of work. I want to create this kind of work in my community. And so there's a common, Kim, this question would be for you. There's a common hesitation in funding men's initiatives in this space. How do you address concerns from funders or community members who ask, why should we fund men's programs when women are predominantly the victims of violence?
So there's a few ways I approach that, and there's some very practical and data-driven ways that, in the shelters, we will see 3 victims from the same person who uses violence. And we will keep seeing more victims unless we actually address and hold accountable, like where this violence is coming from. I think that I don't ever tell a funder, like I believe that shelter funding needs to still exist. It is 10 years, no operational increases. Like we could go into all of that. That's a whole nother webinar. But certainly I think it's a both and issue, that it's not about cutting resources to women and children or victims of violence, whatever their gender. It's about actually balancing and targeting some of the causal places that lead to violence. We will, and I say this all the time, if we do not work with men and boys, and if we do not engage in some of the prevention strategies, we can just keep building shelters and we will fill them. We will keep filling them unless we do something different. And so that typically resonates with people. A thing that is maybe a little more controversial is I talk about how the structures and the systems that we've built, and I said it earlier when I mentioned, I think it was in the first recommendation, that they make victims the author and the victim of their experience. So, and I know people don't want to hear this, but often in our systems of care, there are biases built in. You hear it all the time, even with sexual assault stuff. What did you wear? What did you do to provoke him? I see it all the time in settings in divorces where there's violence and stuff. It's like, well, what did you do to make him breach his order? How did you entice him or seduce him? That sort of thing. And so I think that there does need to be a shift from that way of being and thinking and seeing in this sector, because it obscures the violence. And we do a lot of work with Alan Wade, and I'm very grateful to Jill Weaver Dunlop and our organization and the whole clinical team, because they help. Like language matters, systems matter. And so for funders, I try and highlight some of these subtle ways that we are actually, through our system, reinforcing a system of care that's just going to keep going unless we do something different. So often you'll have to go to funders that want to think a bit differently, that are okay to take some risks. Because I'll tell you, when I remember a few years ago, I announced we had private funding to add just one therapist to our men's program. And I got probably 21 emails and letters from sector leaders. How dare you? Right. And things are different now. I don't think you get 21 letters, you might get 4. But you really do need to help bring funders along to explain the nuances and dynamics of power and violence and patriarchy, and how we need to be dismantling that differently. And that the clinical programs and the programs that work with victims of violence are very critical, and you still need them. You need another approach. Otherwise, you're going to have to keep investing in the victim side of the equation. It can't be one or the other. It has to be both.
Great. Thank you so much. Lynette, there was a question here for you. For the Safe at Home program, do the workers help with reconciliation or family reconciliation at all? Do they do home visits? And what training do your workers have in that program?
Good question. So first and foremost, as we're restarting up the program again, we are doing some current training. So in the past, the staff members have been trained by Nick Todd, who Kim will know very well as yourself, David. So Nick Todd has been instrumental in supporting us, and Nick has tons of experience working with individuals, males who have caused harm. So very important, as well as we're working with Dr. Dawn McBride, who is with the University of Lethbridge, but also has a rich history in domestic violence and abuse in the sector, and specifically to support the work that men do. So we're also being trained from her. Which is also key. The staff members are also currently being trained on Be Safer, which is an assessment tool that we are looking at implementing and using within the program. And with regards to next steps with stakeholders, we are actually forming a stakeholder group, and our hopes is to include Indigenous communities. Also, we have a really great, rich partnership with Foothills Immigration Services here in the Foothills area. So we're going to be also engaging them, as well as we're going to be including our CMP, probation, lawyers. We're hoping to get a rich kind of spectrum within our stakeholders, as well as we were thinking about some individuals who have been working in the sector for a while that would also be able to make a difference. Stay tuned. Another one that we're looking at is we have a good connection with the town of Okotoks. And so we were thinking some town councils might be very instrumental in supporting us within that group. So I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so we are running out of time. And again, my apologies, we're not going to get to all the questions. There was a number of questions about training and where can I get training and where can I learn more. And so I would imagine there will be a post-webinar package. I think some stuff off the top of my head that's really important. Jill's referenced some of the ACWS resources. Pathways Next Gen Men has a ton of webinars, a ton of previous stuff where you can get a ton of information. Men End, the website Men End has a lot of information. They are building out a community of practice. I think I saw Brielle Batty-Smith was in the chat today. She's someone that we can get your contact information because they are building out, they have upcoming learning events. We just hosted the safety and repair workshop with Todd Augusta Scott. So that's another wonderful resource. They are building out a community of practice. Get plugged in there. Fear is Not Love just released a training video called Working with Men Who Use Violence. It's on our website under the resources section. That is with Nick Todd, who Lynette just mentioned. That's a webinar or a free video that's on the website. You can absolutely check that out. And if you need more ideas or you're stuck, email me. You know, we have therapists working with men here, and they are constantly finding and digging up opportunities to do this. So thank you so much for your time today and for spending the past 90 minutes with us. I want to just take a moment to thank Jill, Lynette, and Kim for your time, for your answers, for your honesty as you're digging into these subjects. That brings us to the end of our webinar today. We hope that our discussion fueled your curiosity and passion for working with men in your organizations. Men and boys are role models, allies, and ultimately stakeholders in achieving gender justice and preventing violence. And so we hope that after today, you'll consider reaching out to the organizations and our panelists to continue to learn with and from the leaders in this field. And most importantly, join the Pathways communities through Next Gen Men, where they're offering workshops with Shift, weekly resources, information sharing. It's a great place to plug in and get more information. So within the next day or so, you're going to get a post-webinar package. There's going to be lots of information, handouts, I'm sure the slides, contact information. And if you need anything more, don't hesitate to contact Charlotte, who's the project coordinator from Next Gen Men, to get anything. So thank you again. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Lynette. Thank you to everybody for putting up with my non-professional webinar hosting. And I look forward to the next one. Thank you, everybody.